The Department of Energy just came out with a new loan for automakers in the US to transition to electric vehicles. And in this video, I want to deep dive that loan with you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So here's the announcement from the Department of Energy. Biden-Harris administration announces $15.5 billion to support a strong and just transition to electric vehicles, retooling existing plants, and rehiring existing workers. Here's some additional context of the loan. $2 billion in funding opportunity to spur the conversion of long-standing facilities to manufacture electric vehicles and components. And preference will also be given to projects that commit to pay high wages for production workers and maintain collective bargaining agreements, another word for unions. $10 billion in loan authority available for applications under the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Loan Program for automotive manufacturing conversion projects that retain high-quality jobs in communities that currently host manufacturing facilities. What this basically means is that the Department of Energy has made available $15 billion for Ford, GM, and Stellantis/Chrysler to borrow a portion of that money to retool and reconfigure their existing facilities to transition to electric vehicles. Now, this is on top of an existing loan for GM for the Ultium facility. This was from December 12, 2022. The Ultium facility is GM's battery plant for their current generation EVs. And this is also on top of Ford agreeing to receive $9.2 billion from the US government. Now, the timing of this loan announcement is very interesting because the UAW, the union that's in charge of the factory workforce for all three big automakers, legacy automakers in the US, just announced that they're looking to strike against those three automakers if their demands are not met. Now, the reason why the UAW authorized the strike is because they're asking for higher wages and shorter work weeks, which the automakers haven't agreed to yet. And these negotiations are supposed to end by September 14th. They're currently going back and forth, and there's a lot of news around how the UAW boss, the leader, is not happy with how the legacy automakers are handling the negotiations. Now, for me, I find all this timing very interesting, especially as more and more sales are happening in the United States that are for electric vehicles. But I want to show you some numbers that I'm looking at to help explain why I think this is very weird timing. So this is a summarized version of Ford's balance sheet, basically the thing they report to investors that tell investors how much money they have in their bank accounts. That's a pretty simple way of thinking about it. As of the end of June 30th of this year, Ford had about $47 billion in liquidity, which means that Ford has about $47 billion of both cash and credit available to run its business. In addition to that, if we look at Ford's cash flow statements, which is basically how much money Ford brings in after they take into account all the expenses that go into running the business, for the first half of 2023, from January through June, the company brought in about $3.6 billion in free cash flow, which is that money after all those expenses. And if we do the same for GM, which is the other major automaker in the United States, they have about $38.9 billion in liquidity. Again, that cash balance and credit that they have available. And on top of that, for the first half of 2023, GM brought in about $5.4 billion through the first 6 months of the year. So both Ford and GM have about $86 billion of liquidity, and they're generating about $18 billion in cash per year combined once we take the first half of the year and double it for each company. And so the big question that comes to mind is, why would those companies need access to taxpayer loans when it seems like their companies are very much capable of self-funding the transition? It's no secret that the current administration is pushing for electric vehicles very, very hard, and they have a big competitor out of California and Texas named Tesla, who has been making more and more EVs. And so if the popularity of these cars are really taking off, it seems like these companies have more than enough resources and money to transition themselves. And so from my perspective, I find that these loans being available is very odd. It's super, super odd, especially within the timing of the UAW union going up against those companies. However, if we dig a little bit further into what the financial health for these companies looks like, I think we start to understand why something like this is becoming available for these companies. Now, this is Ford's detailed balance sheet, basically telling investors how much they have on hand from a cash perspective, the assets they have, and also the liabilities like loans that they have outstanding against their business. And as of the end of June 30th of this year, Ford has about $19 billion of long-term debt from their business that doesn't include Ford Credit, and Ford Credit is basically their financing arm that allows you to go to a dealership and lease and loan a car. And they have about $75 billion in long-term debt specifically tied to that Ford Credit business. And if we look at GM's balance sheet as well, you can see that they have about $16 billion in automotive long-term debt and about $65 billion in that financial arm. Same as Ford, it's the thing that allows you to go to a dealership and get a loan or a lease from the dealer. And so if we put these numbers combined for those two automakers, GM and Ford both have about $175 billion in loans towards depreciating assets. And why are they depreciating? One thing to keep in mind for these long-term loans is that Ford and GM have taken these out over the years against their existing gas car business, which poses a really big problem for these car companies if electric vehicles really do take off and they become the standard to drive around. And the reason why is born out of a very simple question. In a world where everybody's buying an EV and that's the preferred mode of transportation, how much value does a gas car have? And I would think about that question in a very similar way as MP3s versus CDs. Once MP3s became available, what is the value of a CD? The loans, as an example, that are against the cars that Ford and GM have sold, the amount of money they're going to get for those cars is going to be a fraction of what they're getting now because those cars are going to become obsolete. So these companies are going to be stuck with these giant balances with an asset that's worth a fraction of what it used to, which is going to cause these companies more likely than not to write off these loans, which is going to cost them a ton of money. In addition to that, because of the UAW demands, if the UAW is successful, that's going to cause a lot of financial strain for both Ford and GM. Here's an article from Bloomberg outlining this. UAW demands would add $80 billion to US car maker labor costs, and this increase will be over 4 years. And so think about that equation for a second. We just calculated that between Ford and GM, they're making about $18 billion per year in cash. That $80 billion over 4 years, if you divide it by 4, that turns into $20 billion of additional costs that these automakers are going to take on. 20 minus 18 seems like these companies, at least between GM and Ford, would be losing money instead of making money just from the UAW getting what they want from a labor perspective. And if you put on top of that the potential depreciating assets from their long-term loans that are tied to the business and to the credit side of the business, you could probably start to see why this could become a very concerning development for automakers. And so the big question that I've been thinking about for quite a while now as I've been covering the electric vehicle segment, are these legacy car companies actually healthy? And is this loan really just a bailout in disguise? I would love to hear what you have to say in the comment section below. If you'd like to support the channel, click subscribe, super easy. And if you want to go above and beyond, I have links to support me in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was informative and helpful, and we'll see you in the next one. Take it easy, everybody. Bye-bye.